son was still in the ground when his wife told me to get out of my own house. Not in those exact words. She was too smart for that. She waited until the reception, until the neighbors had gone home and the casserole dishes were stacked by the door, and then she sat across from me at the kitchen table. The table I built with my own hands 31 years ago from a walnut tree that fell in the backfield. And she said, "We should talk about next steps." I set down my coffee. "Next steps," I said. "The house." She folded her hands. Her nails were done. I remember noticing that. Fresh manicure, 2 days after my son's funeral. "It's a lot of space for one person. You must rattle around in here." I didn't rattle. I'd lived in that house for 34 years. I knew every board that creaked, every window that stuck in the summer heat, every place where the light came in sideways through the oaks in the late afternoon and made everything look like it was on fire. I didn't rattle. I belonged there the way a tree belongs to its own ground. "I'm fine," I said. She nodded slowly, like I'd said something she'd expected and had already planned around. "Well, we'll figure it out. No rush." She left the next morning. I stood on the porch and watched her rental car back down the driveway, and I thought, she said no rush, but she flew home before the thank you cards were written. And she hadn't cried once that I'd seen. My son's name was Elliot. He was 43 years old. He coached his daughter's soccer team on Saturdays and made the best smoked ribs I've ever tasted, and called me every Sunday morning at 9, without fail, for the last 11 years. He died of a heart attack on a Tuesday in October. The kind that comes without warning. Or so the doctor said. Quick, peaceful, no suffering. That's what they kept telling me. No suffering. I don't know if that's supposed to make it easier. It didn't. His wife's name is Bryn. They'd been married 14 years. She's a project manager for a development company out of Phoenix. She's organized, precise, and she speaks in the measured way of someone who has rehearsed most conversations before having them. I'd never disliked her. I'd never fully understood her either. Elliot loved her, and that was enough for me, but standing on that porch watching her drive away, I felt something shift. The way you feel a change in the air before a storm, nothing you can point to, just a knowing in your chest. I went inside and made myself another cup of coffee. Then I sat down at that walnut table, and I thought about the house. I bought the land in 1989. 42 acres in western Virginia, half timber and half cleared field, with a creek running along the south edge that filled with crayfish every spring. I built the main house myself over 2 summers with help from my brother-in-law and the kid from town who needed the work. I added the back porch in 1997. Put in the garage in 2003. My wife planted the garden along the east side and tended it every year until she got sick, and then I tended it for her. And after she passed, I kept tending it because it felt like the one place on the property where she was still somehow present in the soil. The house was mine. The deed was in my name alone. Elliot's mother had passed before we ever updated the paperwork, and I'd simply never gotten around to changing anything after that. The whole property. My name. Nobody else's. I was sure of that. Mostly. But Bryn's no rush had planted something in the back of my mind. And over the following weeks, as Elliot's estate moved through the early stages of probate, I started to wonder. She called once in November, polite, checking in, asking how I was holding up. Then, near the end of the call, almost as an afterthought, "I've been meaning to ask, did Elliot ever mention putting together any kind of joint ownership arrangement? For the property? He talked about it sometimes. Wanted to make sure you were protected." Protected. I turned the word over in my mind after we hung up. Elliot had never mentioned anything like that to me. We talked every Sunday. He told me about his daughter's soccer games and the new smoker he'd bought and the novel he was reading. He did not mention that he'd been quietly arranging joint ownership of my property. But what if he had? What if he'd done something without telling me, thinking he was being thoughtful, thinking he was looking out for his old man? Elliot was a fixer. He liked to solve problems before they became problems. It was possible. I called my attorney. His name is Vince Albrecht. He's been my attorney for 22 years. which means he's been my attorney since before I knew I needed one. He's the kind of man who speaks slowly and listens completely, and has never once, in my experience, given me bad news with anything other than total calm. I found that quality irritating when I was younger. Now, it's the thing I trust most about him. "Bring in everything you have," he said. "Every document, every deed, everything related to the property. I want to see it all. I brought it all." Vince spent 2 hours going through it. I sat across from his desk and looked out the window at the parking lot and thought about Elliot calling me on Sunday mornings. The specific sound of his voice when he said, "Hey, Dad." Like he was genuinely glad to hear me. Like Sunday mornings were something he looked forward to, and not just an obligation he'd built into his routine. "You're clean," Vince said finally. I looked at him. "The property is entirely yours. No joint ownership, no liens, no encumbrances of any kind. Whatever Elliot may have intended, it was never filed, never executed." He slid a folder across the desk. "Your name only. Has been since you bought it." I let out a breath I hadn't known I was holding. "Now," Vince said, leaning back in his chair, "what is it you're actually worried about?" I told him about Bryn, about no rush and protected, and the way she'd spoken to me at the reception like someone opening a negotiation. About the manicure. I know that sounds like a small thing, but grief makes you notice details. She'd had her nails done before coming to her husband's funeral. Vince listened to all of it without expression. "She's his heir," he said when I finished. "She'll inherit whatever Elliot left, but that doesn't include your property, because your property was never Elliot's." "What about the house?" "Elliot lived there as a kid, 14 years. Irrelevant." He paused. "Unless someone tries to argue otherwise." Would that be possible? With a bad enough attorney and a sympathetic enough judge, people argue all kinds of things. He picked up his pen. "Let me make a recommendation." He recommended I establish a land trust. The idea was this: I would transfer the property into a trust with myself as the primary beneficiary during my lifetime and a conservation organization as the secondary beneficiary after my death. The trust would own the house. My name would no longer appear on any deed that showed up in a standard public record search. Anyone looking to make a claim on the property would first have to find the trust, then challenge it, and challenging a properly constructed land trust is complicated, expensive, and rarely successful. It also, Vince said carefully, makes it very clear what your intentions are with the property, which may discourage certain conversations from happening again. I told him to do it. He filed the paperwork in December. By the time the holidays came, the house was no longer mine in the way it had been before. It was mine in a deeper way. Protected. Settled. I didn't tell Bryn. She called me on Christmas Day. My granddaughter got on the phone for a few minutes, and I talked to her about school and her soccer team, and whether she'd gotten what she wanted for Christmas. And she said she wanted the dog, and her mom had said no, and I said I'd see what I could do about that. Then Bryn got back on, and we had a brief, pleasant conversation about nothing, and she said she'd been thinking about visiting in the spring, maybe bringing Cora, my granddaughter. Let her see the property again. I'd like that, I said, and I meant it, because whatever was happening between me and Bryn, Cora was my son's daughter, and she was 12 years old, and she hadn't chosen any of this. They came in April. Bryn arrived with 2 suitcases for a 3-day visit, which I noticed and didn't mention. She walked through the house with the particular attentiveness of someone calculating, not admiring, calculating. She paused in the doorway of the master bedroom longer than was natural, looked out at the back field from the kitchen window, stood on the back porch with her coffee, and measured the view with her eyes. Cora ran straight to the creek and came back an hour later with muddy jeans and a jar full of crayfish. She was her father's daughter. On the second evening, after Cora was in bed, Bryn sat down across from me at the walnut table and said, "I've been looking into some things." "What kind of things?" I asked. "The property. The market out here has really moved. You probably know that." She said it like she was doing me a favor by knowing it. I had someone run comparable sales in the county. The land alone, just the acreage, not counting the house, is worth considerable money. I waited. I've been talking to a developer, she said, someone who does rural residential conversions. He's very interested. And the thing is, Dad, she called me Dad on occasion, always when she wanted something. The thing is, Elliot would have wanted you to be comfortable. He would have wanted you to have security. You don't need 42 acres. You're 68 years old. The upkeep alone must be, I manage, I said. She nodded. Patient. Like I was a child who didn't understand what was good for him. I know you do. But there's real money here. Money that could set you up somewhere nice, somewhere you didn't have to manage. I set down my cup. Bryn, I said, whose money are we talking about? Something moved across her face. Gone in an instant. Well, as Elliot's heir, I'd be entitled to a portion of any proceeds from the estate. The property isn't part of Elliot's estate. She looked at me steadily. That might need to be determined. There it was. I didn't raise my voice. I'd raised a son in that house, which means I'd had 16 years of practice not raising my voice when every instinct told me to. I kept my hands flat on the table and I said, I think you should look into that more carefully before we have this conversation again. She smiled, thin and careful. I intend to. She left the next morning. Cora hugged me at the door, and I held on a little longer than usual, and I whispered to her that I loved her and to take good care of her crayfish. She laughed. My son's exact laugh, coming out of her face. It nearly undid me. I called Vince that afternoon. She found a developer, I said. Faster than I expected, he said, which I think was as close as Vince gets to expressing surprise. She says she'll challenge the ownership. Says it needs to be determined. Let her challenge it, he said. That's what the trust is for. But I wasn't only thinking about the trust. I was thinking about the nurse. I'd been thinking about the nurse for 2 months. Her name came up in a conversation I had with my son's neighbor in December, a retired school teacher who lived 3 houses down from where Elliot and Bryn had lived, and who had known Elliot since he moved into that neighborhood 8 years ago. She called to offer condolences. We talked for a while, and somewhere in the middle of that conversation she mentioned, almost in passing, that in the weeks before Elliot died, she'd seen a woman coming and going from the house on the afternoons when Bryn was at work. I figured it was a nurse, she said. He wasn't feeling well, poor thing. She drove a white sedan, very put-together woman. I didn't want to pry. Elliot hadn't had a nurse. Elliot hadn't been sick. The doctors said the heart attack was sudden, unexpected. A man who appeared to be in good health until he wasn't. I sat with that for 2 months, telling myself I was being paranoid, telling myself that grief does things to the mind, makes it reach for explanations, makes you want someone to blame, because blaming is easier than accepting. I told myself that a woman in a white sedan visiting my son's house proved nothing, but I couldn't let it go. In February, I hired a private investigator. His name is Burl Stanton. He's in his mid-50s, retried sheriff's deputy, runs a small practice out of Roanoke. He came recommended by Vince, which was recommendation enough for me. He has the look of a man who has seen most things and been surprised by very few of them. I told him everything. The neighbor. The white sedan. The nurse who wasn't a nurse. The 2 quick funeral arrangements, handled entirely by Bryn, no viewing, cremation within 48 hours. The developer she'd found before my son was even through the first stage of probate. Burl listened to all of it without writing anything down. You understand, he said when I finished, that most of this is probably nothing. I understand that, I said. And if it's something, he said, it may be something we can't prove. I understand that too. He nodded. All right. He called me 6 weeks later. The woman in the white sedan was named Adriana Page. She was a licensed practical nurse who had worked at a cardiac care unit in the same city where Elliot lived. She had left that position in August, 3 months before Elliot died. According to records Burl had managed to access through contact at a medical licensing board, she had left under circumstances that were described. in the formal language of licensing documentation, as under investigation for procedural violations involving patient medication. She had been seeing Elliot's wife for approximately 2 years. Brennan and Adriana Page had been photographed together by Burrell on 3 separate occasions, in a city 4 hours from where Bryn lived, at restaurants and a hotel, and once walking along a waterfront. The most recent photograph was taken 11 days after my son's funeral. I sat with that folder for a long time. I want to be honest with you about what I felt in that moment, because I think honesty is the only thing that's worth anything anymore at my age. I felt grief all over again, fresh and sharp, because whatever had happened, whatever the full truth was, it meant that my son's last months had included a betrayal he probably didn't know about, that the life he was living, the life he called me every Sunday morning to tell me about, had something hidden inside it that I hadn't known and he hadn't known, and it had been there the whole time. I also felt cold, the same cold I felt when I was young and something bad happened, and I understood that I needed to think clearly and act carefully and not let what I was feeling get ahead of what I needed to do. I took the folder to Vince. Then Vince took it somewhere else. He had a contact at the county sheriff's office. The county sheriff's office contacted the state. The state had jurisdiction because of the potential financial fraud angle. Bryn had already filed certain documents in connection with Elliot's estate that contained statements that Vince's contact described as, at minimum, worth a closer look. They looked closer. They found Adriana Page's financial records, which showed a series of deposits from an account connected to Bryn beginning 8 months before Elliot's death. They found a search history on a device recovered from Adriana's apartment that included, among other things, research into undetectable cardiac events, dosages of certain medications in combination with pre-existing conditions, and, this is the part that still makes my hand shake when I think about it, the specific model of automatic external defibrillator installed in the neighborhood where my son had lived, the defibrillator that would not have been close enough to help him had someone been paying attention to that detail. Bryn was arrested on a Tuesday morning in June, 8 months after my son died. Adriana Page was arrested the same morning, 40 miles away. I was sitting on the back porch drinking coffee when Burrell called to tell me. The sun was just coming up over the east ridge, and the garden was full of whatever my wife had planted 20 years ago that keeps coming back on its own. I don't know the names of all of it. I just keep it watered. And the light on it was the particular gold that only happens for about 20 minutes in the early morning before it turns ordinary. I didn't say much. I thanked Burrell. I sat there for a while after I hung up. My son called me every Sunday morning at 9 o'clock for 11 years. He never missed. Not when he was traveling, not when his daughter was born, not when his mother died and we were both wrecked by it. He still called, and we sat on the phone together and didn't say much but didn't hang up either, because sometimes that's what you do for each other. He was a good man. He was my son, and someone decided that his life was worth less than 42 acres, and the calculation they'd made about what those acres might be worth on a development market. I don't have words for that. I've tried to find them. I don't have them. What I have is this. The property is still mine. The trust holds it with instructions that upon my death, the land passes to a conservation organization that will keep it as open space in perpetuity. The creek and the timber and the backfield and the garden that keeps coming back every spring. It will stay as it is. Nothing will be built on it. I added a provision. A small stand of oaks at the south end of the property, near the creek where Cora caught her crayfish, will be formally designated with a name. A small marker, nothing elaborate. Just his name and the years he lived and the words he called every Sunday. Cora comes to visit 3 or 4 times a year now. She's 13, nearly 14. She's getting tall. She brings a friend sometimes, and they go down to the creek and come back muddy, and I feed them whatever I've got, and they sit at the walnut table and talk about things I only half understand, and I listen anyway because the sound of life in that kitchen is a thing I didn't know I needed until I almost lost the house that holds it. She asked me once, this past summer, sitting at that table with a bowl of ice cream she'd helped herself to from the freezer, "Grandpa, are you going to be okay?" She said it the way her father used to ask me things, straight and serious, looking right at me, no softening, no pretending the question wasn't as big as it was. I thought about that for a moment. The house around us. The field out the window. The oak tree that will have his name on it when the marker is done. The garden coming back every spring without being asked. Yeah, I said, I think I'm going to be okay. She nodded, like that was what she'd expected, and was glad to confirm. She finished her ice cream. I washed the bowl, and outside, the light was doing the thing it does in late summer evenings, going long and gold through the oaks, making everything look like it might last forever. I choose to believe that some things will,